Hi friends, this is a before you read lecture of a sort on the servant songs in the prophetic book of Isaiah. What I want to do with this short video recording is provide a bit of an orientation to these things that have been identified as the servant songs, talk a little bit about why they have been identified as such, and talk about where they fit, where their literary context is within the book of Isaiah. And then I want to talk briefly about some resources that I have selected for us to engage these four servant songs, as well as a sort of approach, a reading approach that will guide this 4-week study. So let me begin with a brief reminder about the book of Isaiah. You may know, or you may have heard, that Isaiah, or parts of Isaiah, have been understood by Old Testament scholars to date from different time periods. So from cover to cover, Isaiah is 66 chapters in length, but critical scholarship on the Hebrew Bible has identified the first 39 chapters as having to do with the 8th century BCE prophet Isaiah of Jerusalem. When we get to chapter 40, verses 40 through 55, we actually see a radically different context. Just a few examples of this different context include the fact that in Isaiah 1 through 39, the author is really concerned with Assyria. But in chapters 40 through 55, the author is concerned with Babylon. Then again, in chapters 1 through 39, we get the impression that Jerusalem is under siege. But by the time we get to chapters 40 through 55, Jerusalem has been destroyed. Then in the first part, Isaiah 1 through 39, there's no mention of Cyrus, the king of Persia. But in chapters 40 through 55, it abounds. It's really, Cyrus takes on a significant role. Then in chapters 1 through 39, there's much more interest in the prophet himself, in Isaiah, his own experience. And then in chapters 40 through 55, that really fades to the background, and we have almost an anonymous writer, an anonymous report. And so for all of these reasons, scholars suggest that Isaiah 1 through 39 was probably written sometime in the 8th century BCE or early in the 7th century BCE, and that what we know of as Second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 through 55, was actually written much later, perhaps around 540 BCE, shortly after the reign or the victory of Cyrus. And then scholars would suggest that Isaiah 56 through 66 is written even later, although there's a good amount of debate about how much later. And so, why does all of this matter? Well, what we will be studying for the next 4 weeks, the servant songs in Isaiah, are actually all found in that second subsection of the book of Isaiah, in chapters 40 through 55. And so I wanted to provide that sort of overview of this material because we need to remember that whatever we say about these really interesting and important sections known as the servant songs, they are embedded within the narrative. They are embedded within this larger literary context of Isaiah 40 through 55, of making sense of exile and the promise of returning from exile, of all of the trauma that goes into watching Jerusalem get destroyed and maybe the hopes of rebuilding a temple. That's the context of the servant songs. You're probably already asking, but what are the servant songs? What the heck are you talking about, Chris? And I'm glad you've asked. The servant songs are 4 discrete or relatively discrete sections in 2nd Isaiah that are spread throughout. These were first identified by a German scholar by the name of Bernhard Dohm in his 1892 commentary. So more than 100 years ago, and this continues to shape scholarship on Isaiah. There continues to be a good amount of scholarly attention to this topic. As one Old Testament introduction puts it, this is sort of the hardest interpretive question, relates to the identity of the servant. And so Doom identified these 4 songs. The first one is found in Isaiah 42, verses 1 through 4. And here the servant is identified as God's chosen one, sent to establish justice throughout the earth. The second is Isaiah 49, verses 1 through 6. And here, instead of speaking about the servant in the third person, the servant himself or herself actually speaks, indicating that he has been chosen by the Lord. The third song is in Isaiah 50, verses 4 through 11. Again, the servant speaks, expresses a deep and abiding confidence in God, despite the fact that hardship and suffering appear to be in the horizon. And then the fourth and final servant song is found in Isaiah 52, verses 13 through 53:12. And this is obviously the longest of the 4. Again, the servant is spoken of in the third person. So no more does the servant speak for him or herself, but is described, spoken about. And this is the one where we get the most clearest indicator of what we would call vicarious suffering. That somehow the servant's experience of suffering has a greater consequence, a greater impact on the broader people of God, on the broader people of Israel. Who is this servant of the Lord? Who are these songs describing? Well, not surprisingly, this is the point where there is so much interpretation and there are a number of options. When we think about it, we can really divide it into 2 options. The servant could describe an individual, or the servant could describe a group, like the personification of Israel. I want to talk about both of these options, and then I'm going to introduce how we will be studying these over the next 4 weeks. So the first option is that these songs somehow describe an individual. And it's important to note that other individuals have been identified as the servant of the Lord, or the servant of God in the Hebrew Bible. These include Abraham and Moses, Joshua and David, Job, and even the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. So when scholars have come to the book of Isaiah, they've suggested that perhaps this is a figure of Israel's past, like Moses or King Hezekiah or Jehoiakim or even the prophet Jeremiah. Maybe, though, it's Cyrus or Zerubbabel, or maybe it's even the prophet of Isaiah 40 through 55 himself. It is uncertain. It's not stated. In Jewish tradition, there becomes an idea that this servant serves as a sort of reference to the Messiah, the expected Messiah of Israel. And of course, the New Testament goes the route of identifying the servant as an individual, specifically Jesus, as we will see in our study together. If one stream is to suggest that the servant is an individual, although we don't know which individual, a second is to say, if we pay attention, there's actually a way in which these servant songs all describe Israel, the collective nation of Israel, or perhaps a small remnant of Israel. And there's evidence for this in Isaiah 49:3 that speaks about the servant, it seems to identify the servant as Israel. But there are, in these servant songs, there's a distinction between the servant who speaks or who is described and Israel. Very often, the servant has a role of bringing Israel back, or of saying or speaking something to Israel. And yet there is, I think, particularly among contemporary Jewish scholarship, an interest in reading these songs as a sort of through the framework of Israel, as if they are describing all of Israel, as though these songs are personifying what it means to be the people of Israel. For the next 4 weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to just move slowly through these 4 servant songs. We'll start this week with Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, the shortest of the 4, and we are going to study them together. And what I am encouraging you to do is make use of two resources that I've provided. The first is the English translation from the Contemporary English Bible. It's the Study Bible edition, so there's notes on the bottom that will help you and help us have a rich and robust conversation about them. I've also included a Jewish Study Bible translation with, again, notes from the perspective of our Jewish brothers and sisters. Again, so a nice little combination there. And as we read, each week as we go through these servant songs, I want you to focus on three things. First, what does the servant song say about Israel, about the people of Israel, about God's covenant people, particularly in the context of emerging out of exile and coming into Jerusalem again after their forced dispersion? The second focus is, what might this say about the person of Jesus as we understand Jesus presented in the Gospels and in the New Testament? And then finally, what might this say about disciples, about people of faith who want to follow in the way of the servant? So again, these I think are three different lenses that we can look at these servant songs with. They're not distinct necessarily. I think that they might overlap in some places. But again, we're gonna focus on, what does this say about the people of Israel? What might this say about Jesus? And what might this say about people of faith, people who follow in the way of the servant? Well, I think that this should be a fun and enlightening and hopefully rejuvenating study during Lent, and I'm looking forward to our continued process of reading through the Bible together. As we slow down the pace and sort of go a little bit deeper, I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts about these 4 Psalms from the book of Isaiah. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.